So I'm aware that there's no shortage of videos about this topic on the internet. I mean, just look at all these beautiful tool displays. But today I'd like to kind of present my thought process and my design process on how I organize my tool wall and generally just like how I prioritize some things in my shop. I'm a fairly scatterbrained individual, but I've tried to boil down what guides most of my decisions into 3 general principles. Now, the first one I've actually already hinted at by specifically using the word display up front. A lot of these tool walls people create look exactly like storefronts to me, or very, very similar. I feel like they are less built for actually being a functional workspace and more designed to just display their tools. But before we dive into the rest of that, I just have to make a couple qualifiers up front so that we're kind of on the same page. First up, my tool collection hardly changes anymore. I think if you're a novice where you're like bringing in a lot of new tools, you're not exactly sure what your future tool collection is going to look like, then I think something like a French cleat system or some kind of modular system we can move stuff around might be worth building. It's probably even good practice just to like mill that many parts and get everything to work out together nicely. But for me, things hardly move. It's been over 2 years since any like major change on this wall. So for me, those systems seem like a waste of time. And then the second thing is that a lot of this is based kind of on the foundation of believing in like Adam Savage's first order retrievability. In my shop, I jokingly call it first order returnability. I'm terrible at putting things away, so having just like a dedicated home for every single tool that I use frequently really helps me just like reorganize my shop from like a very chaotic state that it often is in. All right, now let's get to those 3 principles. Okay, so the first thing that I think is important to consider is that this is a workspace and not a tool display. So everything that goes on this wall, I think it's really important to just like kind of be honest with yourself. Like, do you actually use it frequently enough? Especially like, you know, in my shop being a Quonset, the square footage of it is huge, but I have nothing but round walls. So like this wall right here is far and away the most functional wall space I have in my entire shop. So even though some tools I think look really cool, you know, some big honky tool that I just don't use very often, if I put it here, it would just get in the way of my workflow. So I think that's the first principle, is this is a workspace and not just like a tool display. So the second principle is function and ergonomics. And when I first started building all my tool storage, I kind of underappreciated how much just small little refinements can really make just like a better functioning tool wall. So one of the first thing that comes to mind is like, can you grab the tool in the way you're going to be using it? So for like a screwdriver, can you grab it by the handle? For your pliers, like can you grab them by the handle, how you're going to be using them? You know, I see a lot of plier racks that they're kind of sitting up on a bar like this, or you know, maybe like this, and I feel like you're either going to be grabbing them by like one arm, or you're going to be grabbing them by the head, and at that point, you know, it's pretty easy to transfer them to the way you want to use them, but it would just be, I think, a better designed kind of tool storage if you were just basically grabbing them in the way you're going to use them. Another thing that's been frustrating in my shop a little bit is like visually being able to identify exactly which tool you're grabbing. So coming back to these pliers, I've had these matching channel lock, you know, snips and pliers here. And if I grab the right one, then I'm okay, but half the time I'll be like, oh, no, this is the one I wanted. And then it's just a little cumbersome, or you're just grabbing the wrong tool. So that's something that I think is good to keep in mind. And then finally, like, how is everything interfacing together? This little catch-all rack, like the amount of files I ended up storing in here just kind of exceeded its capacity. And some of my files, you know, are quite long, so it would be a little frustrating to like have to reach around them. So that's just something good to keep in mind, is like, is one little tool storage thing going to get in the way of the other one? And the third principle is basically the footprint. Now, the goal here is to basically pack your tools as tightly as possible while still making, you know, for good ergonomics and good function. And I've definitely watched my fair share of tool storage videos, and I've never heard someone say that if you consider like the 3-dimensional possibilities of how you store your tools, it can really help you in this aspect. I think a lot of the tool storage videos I see, I kind of think of like this Tetris exercise where people have a lot of tools, you know, kind of displayed like this, and it does make for a really nice tool display, but it's just not a very space efficient way to store tools. So let me give you a couple examples here of how I try to utilize this in my kind of design choices. So for this example, let's consider this workbench our tool wall. And I'll see people build, you know, screwdriver racks and stuff. And to do it, they'll basically take their screwdrivers and they'll kind of put them all in a line like this. If they want to save some room, maybe they'll stack kind of like ones, one in front of the other. But I think something really fundamental that I now try to consider is if you take any screwdriver like this, and from like a 2-dimensional, like as if you were going to take a picture of it and you wanted it to take the least amount of space up possible, you would put it on end like this. So instead of having these kind of all these items displayed like this, I'll just try to build a rack where I just see the end of them. Now the screwdrivers I've purchased here, I purposely wanted them to identifiers on the end so I can easily recognize what tool it is. And then this way, they take up the least amount of space. That's been like a real fundamental thing, is like kind of this, you know, considering any tool I'm mounting on the wall, is there like a three-dimensional orientation where I can still maintain good ergonomics? You know, I can grab it by the handle, but its footprint is minimized. Now this obviously doesn't work for everything. If we consider these hand saws here, you know, these are nice and shiny. They make beautiful tool displays, almost kind of like a little rustic accent in your shop. But honestly, you know, they're 2 feet long. You can't like mount them coming out from the wall. It's just, you know, wouldn't be very functional. But even if you just like take the function, instead of kind of displaying them side by side like this to make them look as cool as possible, if you just build a rack for them so that they're, you know, basically in this orientation, you've minimized the footprint greatly. So that kind of three-dimensional thought process is something that I do with every single thing that I try to design for my tool wall. But the truth is, these two saws, I hardly use them for my work. So they actually live in a drawer. I just pulled them out as an example. But let me quickly show you all the little things I'd like to pull off in my little bit of time I have here to refine my tool storage. All right, so I've actually pulled basically every item that was kind of cumbersome to use in this rack, and now the rack looks pretty empty, but now as I bring new little things into my workflow, they'll land there. I would like to build a specialized rack for my screwdrivers, as well as I just picked up a little set of these little picks. I used to use kind of a mismatched set, but they were nice and cheap, so I just picked up a little set of those. Then I've got all my files I'd like to build a rack for, and I've got these 3 scrapers that I use for a lot of wood cleanup that I'd also like to build a little storage cubby for. These 3 little mini planes, I've got some bigger planes, but the work I primarily do, you know, trying to build lightweight cabinets, I don't get to play with my bigger hand planes a lot, but these 3 mini ones I use all the time. Pliers, you know, vice grips and all, rack for those. Metal snips, I use those a lot, and scissors. I think that can kind of maybe have its own little rack altogether. Then here's the 5 saws I do use frequently, almost every day. Currently, all of them sort of live in different spots in the shop, so I'd like to just build one unified rack. I've got 2 new kind of hammers that I've started using pretty frequently, so I might expand this hammer rack. These card scrapers, my card scraper collection has really grown, and it's been annoying to basically like pick one out of the back, so I might just recut this little thing with these slots being cut across the front here, so I can just kind of file through all of them a lot easier. This little rule rack, this piece of walnut wasn't so happy after I cut all these slots in it, so it has decided to warp. So I might recut this as well as put it at a bit of an angle. So same problem as the card scrapers. I'm not like looking behind for what I'm looking for. It's kind of like a stadium seating thing, so I can see it easier. But besides that, you know, I've been pretty happy with the storage wall. And again, I've only got a little bit of time, so we'll see if I can actually get to all these projects. So up first, I did the screwdriver holder. This was the easiest project on the whole list. I just found a scrap piece of wood, laid out what seemed like a good spacing between each screwdriver, and then just drilled some angled holes on the drill press. And then I attached it to the existing kind of catch-all rack I have. Okay, so that's the finished screwdriver rack. I've got room for 3 more up top, as I'm sure something else will come into my shop that I want to store here. You know, I think this kind of satisfies all my categories. I probably could have positioned them a little bit closer together, but you know, I went 1 3/4 inches apart. Probably could have done 1.5 inches, but you know, it's nice to have room to pick everything up. This way I can pick it up by the handle. I can easily see like where I'm placing it, where the holes are, and based on the screwdrivers I've purchased, it's easy to identify which one is which. These 3 hex drivers, Allen drivers, whatever you want to call them, don't have a marking, but incidentally the sizes I use most, which is 4, 5, and 6 millimeter, the handles come in different sizes, so that's, you know, me being familiar with my shop, pretty easy cue for me there. So I'll finish up with that. So onwards to the file rack. Making this thing felt kind of clunky. I mean, there's just these giant kind of chunks of wood that I'm using. I'm gluing them to these outside little pieces of plywood to hold the whole thing together, and I'm just using a little scrap piece of wood as a spacer. This way I kind of have these horizontal slots that are at an angle so I can slide all my files into it, but it just felt like this big, weird, clunky thing. Thankfully, it did turn out functioning just as I wanted, and then the top and bottom piece that are like the biggest block chunks, I ended up drilling out bigger holes in them to hold kind of more like straight files, and then at the top I decided to put my scrapers. For how crude this thing felt when I was building it, I was pretty happy with the function. Unlike in the catch-all rack, things were just a little too long for it with how large the openings were there. Things could like fall out just because they were too kind of end heavy. But this thing held everything nicely. The very top of it where I've got my scrapers, I do have to reach around some of the files a little bit, which isn't ideal. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the improvements to this thing. And continuing. Up next, I decided to work on the card scraper holder, which I decided to combo with my little holder for my 3 planes. So for the top piece, I just took a scrap chunk of wood, cut a bunch of slots in it so I could put my card scrapers in there. And then for the bottom portion to hold the planes, I built a little 3-sided box, and then I just super glued some thin little pieces of wood to kind of separate the 3 planes so they all have their own little individual home. This thing was pretty simple, and I think works just great. Card scrapers have now gone this way, so it's a lot easier for me to sort which one I want. My 3 mini planes are there. I like this little cubby. I think it's fairly compact, doesn't take up too much room. So onwards to the plier rack. I couldn't find a large enough piece of scrap plywood in my shop to make this all out of one piece, but by essentially gluing these 2 pieces together, I could cut all these little divider slots in one pass on the table saw. Okay, so the whole reason to cut all these 2 pieces together is that now, this I can just fold up to make the piece against the wall. And then if I cut a little bit off the front here, that will become like the front lip that I wanted. Then I just got to cut a whole lot of squares to kind of drop in that gap, drop in all these slots here. So that's why I decided to tape those 2 together. If you have a scrap piece of plywood that's just big enough from the start, then you don't have to do such shenanigans. So then I took these pieces of plywood, trimmed them to the sizes I wanted, and then glued the thing together. Then I glued on the end caps, and this is a fun little time-saving thing I like to do in projects like this. Instead of trying to pre-cut these end caps to be the exact size I need, I'll just glue them on oversized, and then I'll take a flush trim router bit and basically trim them to the matching shape. At this point, things were getting pretty late in the night, and I needed to get more work done, so I actually stopped filming just so I could work a little bit faster. Okay, good morning everybody. It's now the next morning. I'm continually impressed how much I'm slowed down when trying to film. So about 10 p.m. last night, I just cut the cameras off and got as much done as I could. I really need to move on to some actual work, and I'm still, my shop is a freaking disaster right now. So we're gonna try to get this finished up by about noon and then actually be productive. So let me give you a little bit of an update. So this thing's done. I got my saw rack done. It mostly turned out exactly how I wanted, minus one of my saws. I'll show that once we're actually loading it. And my plier rack is done. And I know that means that doesn't look like a whole lot because everything's a disaster, but I kind of sat around last night and kind of thought about how I want to lay all this out. One of the things I've absolutely, not hated, but a frustrating thing about racks like this is that you got to pull these out. So essentially I can't mount anything up above here. But I had this idea that maybe I could actually take my chisel rack and mount it on the underside of my plier rack. And that way I can pull my chisels straight out as well, which is I think a really good way to reduce footprint. Is anytime you design a rack where you can pull the thing out towards you instead of having to pull it up, I think that really helps save space. So that's the first thing I'm going to play around with, is whether or not I can move those chisels to the bottom of the plier rack. And if that works, then a whole bunch of other pieces will fall into place. The last things I still really would like to tick off this list is to get the hammer rack adjusted so I can attach my 2 new hammers, and then this little rule holder, that if I can get that rebuilt, then I think I'll actually take my tape measures and put them on this tray. But anyways, enough blabbing and time to get some work done. So mounting the chisels underneath the pliers, I'm actually pretty happy with that idea. I think it does look like an abomination. If I had thought about this, a little bit more, I would have made the plywood line up a little more nicely on the sides. But anyways, I think this is going to work pretty well and definitely saves me some wall space. Okay, so it turns out I actually did not film modifying my card scraper rack to become my new rule rack, but this was pretty simple. I just cut a couple extra slots in it, and then I kind of cut an angle chunk out of the middle of it so I could remount it as my new rule holder with kind of that angled stadium display so that I could easily sort through everything. So finally I was down to the last item I really wanted to get figured out, and that was how to store my hammers. So I decided to reuse part of my old hammer rack. I basically was going to keep my 3 wooden hammers and then the 2 plastic mallets in this, and then I decided to build a separate little holder for my 2 kind of metal hammers. This worked just fine, and after shifting things around, the hammers fit really nicely into this little slot right here. So here's the finished product. I'm really happy with how this turned out. You know, this kind of left side of the tool wall here, I would say it's fairly saturated, but I've actually got quite a bit of free space left here on the right. You know, to the point where like my towel rack and my gloves, I've got them mounted there, and then all my rules, like my longer ones that, you know, I don't like hanging them all off of one nail because then you got to kind of file through whichever one you need. They're all just there right now, spaced individually. I had enough room to do that, so I'm pretty happy about that. In terms of like what's moved on the wall, you know, like I moved these little plastic cubbies down from up here. I found basically whenever I would like pull one of these out, these hold like my brads and my staples. I'd have to set them on the counter there anyway, so now they just live on the counter. And I've got a little zone in front where I can pull them out and sort. That allowed me to mount my hammers right here. Everything in this kind of catch-all rack that annoyed me, which is primarily all these like handled items, all my files and all my screwdrivers now kind of have independent homes, so they kind of make accessing the rest of the stuff in here easier. I'm not like reaching around like long awkward objects to pull stuff out. So I think that worked really well to pull all the cumbersome items out of that. This saw rack I'm really happy with. You know, it took me some thinking on how to exactly store kind of 3 different styles of saws in this like one little compact zone. But even though it is mounted up high, you know, since the handles are all in the lower portion, it's really easy to still access them all, and it's just nice and compact. So planes are right here. Those store nicely. Card scrapers are way easier to sort through and get the one I want. This rule rack is actually, as I mentioned earlier, rebuilt out of my old card scraper rack. So that was simple. And then like the last kind of experiment I did was to get these, all my chisels mounted to the bottom of my plier rack. So that's kind of a wrap on that. Fairly happy. And now I can get back to actually doing something productive. So that's an overview of all the changes I've made to my tool wall in the last few days here of work. You know, I think just keeping in mind, you know, that's not a tool display. So you got to do what's basically most ergonomic to be used and like has the lowest footprint so you can save room. I try to keep those things in mind, and I think it helps me build a workflow that I think is really efficient for the kind of work that I do. And yeah, hopefully you find some of this useful. You can use it in your shop, and thank you so much for watching.